Welcome to the seminar and my contribution. I am Göran Lennartsson and I will bring up the issue of types of replacement theology, two exegetes on constructual supersessionism. And my background is the research that is done, parting of the ways since 40-50 years back, where the relationship between Jews and Christians, Judaism, Jews and Christianity, has been re-evaluated from a replacement theological point of view, has now been replaced by a post-supersessionist situation, and that is my starting point. From the schedule, from this coming 20 minutes, I will bring up discuss the meaning of all Israel in Romans chapter 11, verse 26. The meaning of what is referred to by all Israel in Paul's mind. Paul's agony is that the response of the gospel is quite poor among his own people. And that is the discussion he brings up in chapters 9 to 11 in Romans. And I will quote just as a start from the three first verses of chapter 9. Paul says, I have great sorrow, unceasing anguish in my heart, for I would wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. And then he continues in the following 3 chapters in Romans with a discussion, and ends up in a conclusion in chapter 11, verse 25 to 27. And that is the part and the expression pas Israel, all Israel, what I want to bring up. So what is Paul's solution of this dilemma? The anguish that he fights in himself. His conclusion is, Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles have come in. And so all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So what exactly do he mean with all Israel who will be saved at the return of Jesus, parousia? That is the most probable reference that he has. What do all Israel refer to? Well, I will bring up 3 possibilities that is proposed in Christianity, in dogmatism, and among exegetes. Israel could be the Israelites, his people, the people that Paul belongs to, according to chapter 9, verse 4, which I just quoted, the Jewish nation. Or, especially the church fathers, most of them, they proposed that all Israel is the new Israel, which is replacement theology. The church has replaced Israel, and that church will one day be saved. And the third option I bring up here is a proposed redefined Israel. And I will present 2 exegetes that propose this, that all Israel is Jesus-believing Jews together with Jesus-believing Gentiles. And my question will be, is that supersessionism or not? And the two exegetes are one Swedish, Mikael Telbe, and he writes in Swedish as an article in this book, Paulus mot väggen, Paul against the wall. And one of the issues is exactly this passage in Romans 9:11. He's a quite influential, I would say, evangelical exegete in Scandinavia and Sweden. Writes mostly in Swedish, but he has big books also in English, articles and 2 dissertations. And then N.T. Wright, well-known British Anglican evangelical, and they are quite similar, so I will not sort of try to compare them, but I will bring their proposed interpretation anyway further. And 2 words about supersessionism. There are 3 aspects of that, and I take that from Kendall Solen's book, The God of Israel and Christian Theology. Speaks about economic supersessionism, which means one era replaces the other. The era of Israel is replaced by the era of the church. Like a relay race where there are several participants and one runs after the other. So after the Christian era, the Jewish or Israel is replaced. It's over. The punitive is more the punishment that the Jewish people received after the proposed, I would say, punishment of losing the covenantal calling after refusal of accepting Jesus in the overall Israel society. And then we have also a third kind of supersessionism, structural, and that is if there is a built-in theological pattern in the thinking after which you interpret some texts. And we will come back to that. These are the 3 sort of options to try to analyze the text from. So I start from the definition of supersessionism as a way, or several ways, one way to disconnect the nation of Israel or the Jewish people from God's calling to be his covenantal people on Sinai, and transferring these covenant promises to Jesus believers, the Christians, the ecclesia or the church. And I will do this analysis out of the 2 books that I mentioned, which is 1 chapter in Telbe's book and basically an article in Wright's book as well. So it's not their total production, and it's out from this limited part of text. They start from, the premises are that they are not themselves considering them as substitutional theologians. They don't see a taking over of the church from Israel, but a continuation. I will not bring in possible motives that drive them, but I think it's legitimate to give a fair analysis on their underlying ideology to their interpretation. They also think that Jews as a people group is preserved beside the church throughout the centuries, throughout history. They reject the two covenantal theology, two double covenant theology. There are two separate ways for Jews and Christians to become God's children. Also, they refuse or distance themselves from the traditional, I would say, interpretation among non-supersessionists that Israel will be restored, the nation will be restored at the return of Jesus. So two fundamental questions. First, Israel in Romans. I would propose that in Romans chapter 9, Paul speaks about himself as the Jewish nation collectively. Regardless if you are a believer of Jesus or not, you belong to the Jewish nation. And that is the same as to say the God's Israel. Those who carry the calling of, not necessarily living in the calling, but the calling of being the people of the covenant. For Telbe, he says that the rest, the remnant that Paul is mentioning several times in the chapters 9 to 11 in Romans, refer not only to Jews but also to Gentiles. And that the covenant people, Israel, in the text is redefined, which means that the definition of Israel in chapter 9:4 is not necessarily the same definition that occurs in 11:26. So the nation and people of Israel and the Jesus-believing part of Israel, together with Gentile Jewish believers, constitute Israel in the new defined situation in chapter 11:26. So WT stands for Wright and Telbe. They base their redefinition, the proposed redefinition of Israel, on basically three texts or contexts. First is Romans 2:28 to 29. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly. The circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. And then in Romans 9:6, Paul says, not all who are descendants of Israel are Israel. And what both these gentlemen are trying to say, as far as I understand, is that this is a redefinition that already Paul initiates. But I think it's very problematic, because what Paul says, in my mind, is that it's a matter of whose Jew is Jew. It's not to say that a Gentile can become a Jew. It's always limited by the group of Jews. And the third text, 6:16 in Galatians, peace and mercy to all who follow his rule, even to the Israel of God. Who is the Israel of God that Paul refers to? It's a very obscure, difficult text to interpret, but in the minds of Telbe and Wright, this refers to the ecclesia, to the church, to the Jesus believers, Jews together with Gentile believers in Jesus. If we continue then to the next question, basic issue, what does the whole of Israel, pas Israel in Romans 11:26 stand for? They propose that Israel here is expanded, an extended, redefined meaning of Israel. God has only one people. those who believe in Jesus. Wright says on page 52 that Pas Israel is identical with Israel according to the flesh, Galatians 6:16, and I quote, larger company of believing Jews and believing Gentiles, unquote. Telbe speaks about the rest of believing Jews and Gentiles, together with those Jews that receive Christ, the deliverer. So to Telbe, all Israel is all those who belong to the church, plus those Jews, those who belong to the people group Jewish nation at the time of the parousia and accept Jesus. They will also be included. So there's an eschatological aspect to what Telbe suggests. It's interesting to notice that the expression that Paul most probably is using, pan-Israel, Panta Israel, but pan-Israel is the phrase, the idiom, that comes from the Septuagint. Several times, I didn't count exactly, but quite numerous of times. It's also used in the rabbinic tradition, and probably it was well used, well understood by the readers of Romans as well as the Hebrew speaking. And it goes back to the Hebrew Kol Israel. And that is my critique to start with. While leaving out the possibility, and to my mind very probable, meaning and reference in Paul's mind and the listener's ears, that the idiom Pas Israel is coming from the Bible. It's a biblical term. The fullness of Israel, the representative part, not necessarily every individual, but the fullness of the nation Israel. And then the nation is referring, of course, to the Sinai community, those who carry on the covenant calling. Secondly, my critique is what Telbe and Wright suggest does not fit well with the metaphor of engrafting in Romans 11:17, which explain the difference that in the church you have Gentiles and you have Jews. You don't have a mix of some converted, if you like, Gentiles becoming Jews. It is Gentile by status and Jews by status united in Christ through Jesus. Thirdly, it does not harmonize with Paul's ecclesiology expressed, for instance, in Ephesians 2:11 and the following, where Paul's point is that the Gentile believers, before the Jesus entry, before Jesus came and before they accepted Jesus, were excluded from Israel, but now share with Israel the promises from the covenant. So it's a unity in Jesus through sharing, which means Israel, the Jewish people, are those who carry on and make the covenant, the new covenant, available, and the Gentile believers in Jesus have access to the covenant through them. Fourth point, Gentile becoming Jews, a kind of spiritual proselytism, is not found, as far as I understand, anywhere else in Paul's thinking. He rejects the physical Judaizing, but even the spiritual proselytism is not what I can see appearing in Paul's letters. And Galatians 6:16, I already mentioned. I think it's very weak support. It gives a very thin, I think, weight to thin thread to support the thesis of Telbe and Wright. And also number 6, my critique is that it is really a revelation, a mystery, something God has to reveal from his own decision from eternity. Is that needed for such an insight, which basically means that the people saved, they will be saved. Those who belong to the saved nation, those who believe in Jesus, they will also ultimately be saved. That is a logical conclusion rather than a need for a revelation in my mind. And then lastly, number 7, I think it's an inconclusive interpretation in Romans 2:28-29 and even 9:6 that those who, to take the way Paul is reasoning now of that true Jews also should live by faith. That doesn't mean that Gentiles can, by faith, become a Jew. And to the end, my sort of evaluation, the point made by Wright and Telbe that the redefinition of Israel already is invented by Paul, I don't find at all convincing. There is no straightforward replacement thinking by these two exegetes. The church is not a successor of Israel, but the difference of reference between Israel in the Old Testament and those in 11:26, I don't think is a good analysis by this interpretation. Israel has rejected the gospel, quote from Telve. That's one thing. That's the obvious, I think, starting point for Paul. But where does Paul and in the rest of the New Testament connect Israel's rejection of the gospel with rejection of Israel's calling as a covenant people of God? I miss this discussion in those two articles. And there is a structural transition. Telbe and Wright, they think that the Gentiles becomes Jews and thus enter Israel's promises. Faith in Jesus means transition of status from Gentile to Jew. I think that could be challenged. I don't, as I said before, I don't find that in harmony with Ephesians chapter 2, for instance. And lastly, this looks, in my mind, that Sulen's description of supersessionism as structural supersessionism is applied by Telbe and Wright through a hermeneutic method by trying to redefine both Israel and Gentiles. And I am not, I don't think they succeed in this. Thank you for listening, and thank you for the time I could spend, and God bless us.